If you are a product security head, CISO, or head of application security, I'm going to be talking about 4 tips that I have for you to get better with your AWS security and have some serious AWS security success. The fourth tip, which is going to come at the end, is going to be probably the most important tip that I have to give. So stay tuned and watch till the end of the video. Tip number 1, and unsurprisingly, it's IAM. Simply because IAM is probably the most abused, misconfigured, and attacked aspect of the cloud. When an attacker wants to compromise your cloud environment, be it AWS or Azure or Google or Alibaba or whatever cloud you're using, the way they would do it in most cases is to steal credentials. And stealing credentials typically means that the attacker is able to find some resource that is either misconfigured, and that resource may have a lot of privileges to your cloud. So let's say they compromise an application and that application has star privileges on whatever other AWS resource. They may be able to escalate privileges very quickly and start accessing a whole bunch of things that they should not be able to access. IAM is going to be your number one focus area if you are in security leadership, especially dealing with the cloud. Focus on converting all these long-term credentials into short-term credentials. One of the things that a lot of people do with the cloud, they configure users, they configure groups, they configure roles, and they tend to have long-term credentials. The problem with that, somebody else can use that and gain access to your AWS account, and you won't know about it until you actually have a massive incident, right? So that is something that you have to keep in mind. So IAM, first, reduce the possibility of long-term credentials. So roles over, persistent user keys and secrets, and make sure that even if you're using AWS with CI systems, CD systems, and so on, try and use OpenID Connect or OIDC over using long-term credentials. This is the first thing that you can think of when dealing with AWS. Then the second thing that you have to think about is IAM access analysis, because a lot of times what happens is that the access parameters that your application need and what your applications actually end up getting is quite different, right? So you have to analyze access patterns often and make sure that unnecessary accesses are pruned on your AWS account. So this means that you have to constantly either automate, run tools. You have a whole bunch of tools out there, both in open source and commercial, that you can use to reduce your IAM sprawl. So this is something that you should consider doing, and you have to, because this is really something that people go after when they are attackers or when they're trying to compromise your AWS account. So IAM would be tip number 1. Focus on IAM. And focus on IAM. Start yesterday focusing on IAM. That's going to be tip number 1. Tip number 2 is about basically observability and monitoring, right? Now, this is something that a lot of people don't really think about when they're getting into security, and they pay a heavy price for it later down the road. With the cloud, you pay a heavier price because with the cloud, you have all the tools. You have so many different services. You have so many different things that are happening inside that cloud account. If you don't think about this problem, you will end up paying a heavy price in terms of being able to identify security issues. So with this, you basically need to understand that AWS has a whole bunch of monitoring solutions. You have a whole bunch of solutions generating the logs, and you have a whole bunch of solutions that can be used to collect the logs and enrich the logs from that point on and get you some kind of monitoring and observability from these logs. Now, these are basically logging services. Now, you can use these services and start enriching these logs and start doing some kind of slicing and dicing and data analysis, on top of which you can use that for security purposes. If you want to kind of make it simple, get started at least with something like Guard Duty, which gives you some kind of threat detection on AWS. It tells you whether your credentials have been compromised. It tells you whether your hosts are publicly accessible and so on. It has a whole bunch of rules that can get you started off with it. But over time, you definitely need to build out a much more mature monitoring and observability capability based on the kind of services that you're running in AWS. And this is something that you will need to mature over time. It doesn't happen in a day. It doesn't happen in a month. It takes much longer than that for it to happen. So this would be tip number 2, set up and think about monitoring in a very serious way. Tip number 3, this is something that a lot of people don't really think about, but I would think that it's extremely important when dealing with AWS. Remember, AWS has a ton of services. You have a ton of services. You are dealing with Kubernetes services, you're dealing with cloud services, you're dealing with a whole bunch of services. One of the challenges with AWS or any of the services that you're dealing with is understanding where your responsibility starts and where it stops. Now, this is basically understanding something called the shared responsibility model. Now, with AWS, each service might have a slightly different AWS shared responsibility model. So that is something that you have to think about when you're trying to secure services on AWS, because you need to understand where your security responsibility starts and where that responsibility stops. And this is one of the key things you need to understand before you can understand how you can secure these services on AWS. Before we get to the fourth tip, I want to talk about a pretty big problem that I'm sure you and a lot of contemporaries in the industry are seeing, which is the AppSec and cloud security skills shortage. Now, there is no denying it. It's very hard to find people who are trained and who have the ability to solve your AppSec, cloud security, Kubernetes, DevSecOps problems. These are problems that every company like yours are facing, right? This is something that you would see that a lot of people are facing and a lot of people are dealing with in terms of a shortage of skills. Now, there are two ways to go about it. I mean, obviously, there is going to be a shortage. There is something that you have to deal with. But what you can do is make sure that you solve that shortage through some proactive means. And that proactive means is actually getting people trained in a way that is hands-on, practical, and real world. And this is where AppSecEngineer comes in. Now, AppSecEngineer delivers all of these content, right? Threat modeling, DevSecOps, Kubernetes security, cloud security, application security, and much, much more in a hands-on, real-world, non-gamified way. AppSecEngineer delivers all of this content so that your organization can scale up and really battle the skill shortage through real actionable courses that they can take and get better at it. In fact, we're even launching a new feature called Challenges that makes all of this much, much more powerful to be able to actually assess their skills and learn from this hands-on experience. So check out AppSecEngineer if you're already not done. Now let's come to our last and final tip, which is going to probably make a lot of difference when you're dealing with AWS security or cloud security in general. Now, this is tip number 4, cloud security posture management. Now, this is also called CSPM, and this is becoming an increasingly important category in cloud security. So what is CSPM? So CSPM is basically a set of tools or set of capabilities that you build as part of your cloud environment that assesses your cloud environments for misconfiguration issues, compliance issues, lack of best practices, and so on and so forth. Cloud Security Posture Management, or CSPM, helps you identify what some of the biggest issues that you have with the cloud, right? So basically, those are misconfigurations. Now, let's say your company is dealing with compliance issues. Your compliance is also going to be an extremely important thing you have to deal with. Let's say you have to comply with certain best practices or regulatory requirements like PCI DSS or NIST or CIS or whatever it is. This can help you do that as well. Now, Cloud Security Posture Management, or CSPM, sounds like it can only be done with expensive tools, but it's really not the case. Some of these tools are even built into Amazon. With AWS, you have AWS Config that helps you do CSPM. You have tools like Cloud Custodian that can help you write your own custom rules. It's completely open source that you can use. You have tools like SteamPipe and Cloud Query and so on that can help you do cloud security posture management. The idea here is that you can't just do cloud security posture management as a one and done kind of thing, right? It has to be continuous, which means that it has to constantly measure your cloud environment to identify these security issues, which means that you need to have a process of running this, identifying the security issues, and having the right folks in your team fix or take action against these cloud security misconfigurations. One of the things you have to do as an AppSec leader, ProdSec leader, or cloud security leader is that you have to take action to make sure that your CSPM is implemented in a continuous way. And this will really help take things forward with your AWS security. And this will make your AWS security a lot more successful. So there you have it. You have all 4 important things to make sure that you have AWS success. First, focus on IAM. Second, focus on monitoring. Third, understand shared responsibility. A lot of people don't understand it, and they assume that the cloud provider is taking care of a lot of security things that they're actually not taking care of. So think about that. And fourth, think about cloud security posture management. And you should ensure that having these kind of controls in place is a good way to get you moving in the right direction in AWS security. As always, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope it worth your while. Thanks.